Russia and Belarus have begun joint air force drills amid growing concern Moscow could be pushing its ally to join the war in Ukraine. Belarus maintains that the exercise is, quote, purely defensive in nature. But the ongoing buildup of Russian troops in the country, combined with a flurry of military activity, is an echo of what happened just before Russia invaded Ukraine in February last year. Kyiv has continuously sounded the alarm of possible new attacks coming from Belarus. A Russian foreign ministry official has also warned that Minsk may enter the conflict if Kyiv decides to, quote, invade either Belarus or Russia. On the ground, hopes of rescuing survivors after a deadly Russian strike over the weekend are fading. At least 40 are dead following Saturday's missile attack on a residential building in the Ukrainian city of Dnipro. Emergency workers say they could hear people trapped under the rubble screaming for help, but the window of rescue for any survivors is closing due to the freezing temperatures. The Kremlin has denied targeting residential buildings in Dnipro. Rosie Burchard joins us live from Brussels with more. Rosie, how has the EU been reacting to the latest joint drills by Russia and Belarus?
Well, the European Union has long considered Belarus as a country which is essentially, it says, aiding and abetting Moscow in its ongoing war against Ukraine. And to that end, the European Union did in 2022 impose sanctions on dozens of military personnel from Belarus, accusing Minsk of allowing Russian troops, for example, to refuel on Belarusian territory, to store weapons there, and even to use it as a base to launch ballistic missiles into Ukraine. So these latest drills will not necessarily be seen as any sort of a dramatic escalation, given that Brussels already considers Belarus to be basically supporting Russian President Vladimir Putin in these ongoing attacks on Ukraine. However, Kyiv will be, as you rightly mentioned, sounding the alarm here, sounding the alarm that this could be a repeat of what we saw in 2022, a fresh invasion from Belarus into Ukraine. And with that, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will likely be suggesting that these drills are a signal that could be something we see again, and therefore will be using that as a tool to try and convince Western countries to supply Kyiv more weapons to try and defend itself on the battlefield. Now, Western countries and some of the allies of Ukraine are expected to meet later this week at an airbase in Germany to discuss military aid to Ukraine as this war drags on. Of course, it's the middle of the winter here in Europe just now, but spring is approaching and new offensives are expected in Ukraine.
Well, the bloc has pledged new sanctions against Belarus over its support of Russia. What other actions will Brussels take, and how effective will those likely be?
You're correct. The European Union is expected to announce fresh sanctions. So in addition to those I mentioned that came in 2022, new sanctions against Belarus. That could be as soon as in a week's time, on the 23rd of January, the European Union's foreign ministers are expected to meet. So that could be tightening the screws, for example, on some imports for Belarus, or exports indeed. But I think it's clear that it seems clear, at least, that those sanctions will likely move forward smoothly. What's more difficult for the European Union now, becoming increasingly difficult, is when it comes to further sanctions on Russia, because what Belarus is being accused of here is supporting Russia. So Moscow is still very much seen as the instigator here. And the EU has imposed successive rounds of sanctions on Moscow, and it has condemned this latest deadly attack that we saw in Dnipro. Of course, Russia denying targeting civilian infrastructure there, but the EU very much condemning Moscow for what it accuses of Moscow of involvement in that and of targeting civilians and causing civilian casualties. But the more sanctions the EU pursues against Russia, the more it becomes politically difficult within the bloc to try and get agreement on that. And I should say that sanctions are something which within the European Union require unanimous support. We'll see how that develops when European Union foreign ministers meet next week. But it's a discussion which will likely continue, intensify, and indeed become more difficult in the coming months.
Thanks, Rosie. Rosie Burchard reporting live from Brussels.